Real pleasure for me to sort of see if we can get some discussion on what Reed said. The sort of most important part is where do we put this stuff? And that's really where the accounting comes through. The emissions are gauged, and that's the consumer issue. I mean, it's the cars. I mean, it really comes down to the cars. So Reg Modlin has a 40-year career with Chrysler. We're just delighted that he came in for this. He's been a great advisor to several of our groups, 2525 and Ernie's Ag Auto Ethanol Group, my group, Clean Fuels Development Coalition. Reg is retired, but continues to be an advisor in many ways, and certainly he and I talk about these issues all the time. But we thought it was very important. Reg has a technical background in engineering, a legal background in law. Again, 40 years. I met him when I was a young pup and the Clean Air Act was just starting. But very fortunate to have you engaged in the ethanol end of things now and able to get you to say some things you couldn't necessarily say when you were with Chrysler. So that's the good news. But we do want to talk about that, and I thought maybe we could just freewheel a little bit, Reg, on, you know, we all think it's just so easy. We make this stuff, we know the benefits, let's just put it in cars. Why aren't cars using it? Why don't you do it? But all of the issues that you know better than anybody, whether you like them or not, the legal ramifications, the studies that have to be done, the body of evidence, things that we might consider anecdotal, particularly out in the countryside where we're running fuel and say, hey, the car didn't break down, it must be fine. There's a little bit more to it than that. And so we're trying to navigate through that, but at the same time, force some of this action, as you've told me many times. Put the fuel out there, get it out there. And if automakers see the fuel out there, they'll see the trend that's behind it. But let's just start, if we could, with some of the things we've discussed over the last couple of days, your outline, but some of the thoughts that from an auto perspective, as you're watching us on the fuel perspective, say, all right, this is what we would need to happen, and these are the obvious obstacles. So let me turn it back to you.
Sure, Doug, and I appreciate being here. This has been a wonderful day. I think this section is, I hope we're going to sort of tie in how does the auto industry fit in with this, but this is all fuels. The discussion today about aromatics and fuel and what the implications are have been well laid out. I think a lot of people can make a lot of use with the information that came out here. So this, I'm just going to try to knit some, let's call it some factoids together, and then hopefully we'll get through this quickly enough so if you have some questions, we can broaden it out to where you wish to have some questions answered. First off, there was a fellow in my team when I was at Chrysler had a little placard up in his office for the whole time he was with the group. And it quoted an unnamed oil CEO. It said something along the lines that the duty of the auto industry is to plan to use the product that we give them. And and that's what you see today. They're out there, and that sausage that we call gasoline is a concoction that they use to, as you saw with the Rockefeller, that's how he got rid of a lot of product he didn't know what to do with. It became this product we call gasoline. So how important is that composition of that fuel? In today's fuel pool, I recall the test fuel island at Chrysler. I'm going to speak maybe with some Chrysler references, but let's be clear. I'm not speaking for any company. I'm speaking on the basis of experience I've had within the auto industry, and I think these opinions, though they're mine, I believe firmly that they're substantiatable through a lot of publicly available information. So anyway, the test fuel island at Chrysler or Park contained something just short of 30 different fuels. That wasn't because there were 30-ish fuel specs. That's because the variety of fuel across the United States and some other countries in the world varies so much. You had to select a representative fuel package, so once you designed a powertrain, that powertrain could be tested to make sure that the vehicle didn't hiccup on some particular formulation because the ramifications are that particular customer or customer group would come back. So it would become a warranty and, heaven forbid, a recall type of situation. So the breadth of test fuels is very broad. And the desire on the part of the auto companies is to narrow that down. If they can get down to 1, that'd be perfect. Because in that 1, they could optimize the performance of those powertrains, where right now they have to broaden it out to accommodate the varying parameters of the many fuels. So that's where the goal becomes in a discussion, the debate of what about that FFE in a vehicle using E85 and E10? They would, under the realm of continuing tightening of fuel economy or CO2 emission requirements, that noose is starting to get pretty firm. And the wiggle room that they indeed had for many years, where the test parameters will allow them to flow within the test results pretty nicely, they're running out of room to wiggle. So the tighter the fuel spec, the better they can meet standards in the future. And then in this case, I think they would then make a choice as to what combustion regime they wish to use, and they can use some more aggressive combustion regimes like high compression engines. The wrinkle this year is with EPA poised to back off the Obama-era requirements, isn't this sort of position sort of nullified? First off, just a personal observation, the Obama-era requirements were never in place. The second phase of the program was only a recommendation, and it was a recommendation, the execution of the recommendation was to be based on a study that EPA was to conduct. And that's what the fight was about as we transitioned between Obama and Trump, where the accusation was that the Obama administration hustled out the results of the analysis before it was really fully baked. So then the reason for backing off is only to reset on the basis of facts that the Trump administration feels are now in place. But the bigger issue is that really going to happen? Yeah, maybe sort of, but please notice that the rest of the world has been playing catch up with the United States standards, United States and Europe, for quite a while. It was United States, Europe, Japan, and maybe a couple of others, outliers. It's now regulations covering something like 70% or more of the world's auto park. Saudi Arabia, for Pete's sake, has fuel economy standards now that are pretty darn strict. So the rest of the world trend is set. And if the United States standards backs off somewhat from what we had a couple of years ago, we'll just be out of sync with everybody else for a while. I'm very confident that at the end of the day, the United States will not be an outlier. And the rest, only during the interim, the rest of the world, including China, will be the ones driving the performance specs for the vehicles that the car companies, in fact, build. Well, okay, then what about that electric vehicle thing? The world's moving to electric vehicles quickly. We saw a slide here that said EPA wants to just wait for the electric vehicles. I agree with the statement that was made. If we get to even 100% of the vehicles on new vehicles being produced by 2030 are electric, it's still going to take 20 years after that for the whole car park to change over. That's a real dreamy position. I think I've seen many studies recently, and all of them fall way short of 50, and most of them fall in a neighborhood of maybe 10 to 20% of the total car park being electric by 2050, which tells you got to have something else if the world is moving towards lower carbon emissions from transportation. That tells me you can't leave the current stinky fuel on the road and hope to get there. You got to do something with the fuel to give the current car park and the new vehicles in the next 20, 30 years a chance of reducing emissions and a chance of reaching some much lower carbon threshold. So that just says that a new fuel is necessary now for the car makers to start planning for the next few years to get those cars on the road that will occupy the car park of the next, by 2050. So what's that technology? High compression, sort of period. There's variants on that, and we can talk about a lot of details that people think about and talk about, but high compression is really the target, and that too was mentioned earlier. The gasoline of the early days needed something to have anti-knock characteristics and that became tetraethyl lead, then became MTBE. Now it's aromatics and ethanol. But with the octane up, which is the key thing, the vehicles can be designed with higher compression, with a known good high octane number in place, well controlled. In the marketplace, the efficiency in the engine can go up pretty dramatically. How difficult is that? It also depends on who you're talking to. It's not. It's more, it's a couple of things. It's one, it's the DOE testing that has been mentioned, Department of Energy, in their national labs. It's underway for a lot of reasons, for direction by the car industry and many others. What they're doing is getting current vehicles, and they're modifying the pistons to give them a better or higher compression, and then testing the vehicles with a modified controller usually provided by the car company. So that tells you where it's at. You know, the heads may need to be redone, the pistons need to be redone, and a controller with new calibration needs to be put in place. Fuel systems are another thing that people keep talking about maybe, and those, but today's fuel systems are the result of an evolution from zero ethanol gasolines, E0 we now call it, through E10. That transition took, 12, 13 years between about 2000 and 2013 or 14. And the car companies got serious about firming up the performance of the fuel system about mid-2000s, where the elastomers throughout the systems all got modified to be tolerant of increased ethanol. How much ethanol? Don't know. But one thing I can say that with great sincerity, the elastomer companies that all the companies share weren't going to come up short. So I don't think they stopped at 15.5% or 10.5 or 10, 15.5%. I think they went way beyond that just to make sure they had lots of headroom and didn't have to modify their formulations again. How much? We got, we'll talk about the E30 test programs in a minute. All right, so how difficult is it to put this in production? These things are already in production, folks. It's in Europe. Europe already has a 98 RON or 95 RON, or 95 average octane fuels in place. And that's where Mercedes gets the absolute 100% assurance that octane matters. They know. They already designed their product in Europe for it, and they have to dumb them down to get to the United States and use our less than optimized gasoline. The technologies are well known. The modification parameters are well known. In production, probably in most, if not all, companies in the world, just not for the product here in the United States. So if the fuel was there, the transition could occur as quickly as the companies can provide tooling enough to produce the volume necessary to produce product in the United States. That is not an overnight situation. That is modification, testing, tooling, certification. So that's a multi-year process, but it is not a difficult one. It just costs money and time. The money and time piece reflects in another. Then the vehicle. One point. There's one comment that gets made fairly often, and that's the engines have to be, our product has to be hardened, and that's going to take time. That too is a fairly clear target. Now these are, I'm giving fairly straightforward pieces, and there are probably smaller things that have to be brought in also, but that term hardening does predominantly aim at the metallurgy of valves and valve seats. To modify those, it does take engineering, takes tooling, takes testing, but once it's done, the car companies are not going to make two engines, not if they run high volumes of these things, because it costs money to run two different products and into inventory and move them around the world. So typically, a company will make the modification to an engine platform, and that would be their 100% production run. So the engine then would be capable of being compatible with the high-octane fuel, provided it has the right calibration in its computer. The calibration in the computer is not insignificant. The artists that do those jobs are not plentiful. They are probably some of the most highly valued people in the industry, and they don't just crank them up off the engineer production line. They need to be trained over years with good experience. So that segment of the engineering team is highly prized, valuable, and not plentiful. So to try to make a switch, when a company argues that it takes time, it's usually in the time to process the testing necessary to get the calibrations done. Again, and when you look at a whole product line, a company that really wants to put something in can drop it into a product in, I'll call out a number, let's say 3 years. A known fairly easy system requires tooling and testing and certification. But to put it through a whole powertrain family within a product, within a company's vehicles, that could take a long time. That could take 6, 10 years at least. Many times something you want to put in production it even takes longer. But let's just, for this conversation here, let's use 6 to 10 years to turn over introduction of some product like this. So at this point, if you're getting a sense for where this goes, if the car companies already sort of know how to make this thing, they made FFVs, they put these things into Brazil, for Pete's sake. You're using 27% ethanol in Brazil, so don't you already have it in production? And if you can do it in Brazil, can't you do it here? Two big considerations there. One is Brazil is a pretty big car market on its own, and they're very protective of their in-country business. They work pretty hard, not as obvious as some countries may, but they work pretty hard about keeping others out. We heard today they have 38 car companies building product in Brazil. And they like to keep it just that way. So most of, in my observation, most of the world's companies, unless they don't build down there at all, they'll bring, if they don't build down there at all, they'll bring some product in, but that's not going to be, I'm going to say, high volume. Or they might team up with a company that does business there and bring their product in that way. That's where he mentioned this morning that there might be, I think, if I heard it right, somewhere in the neighborhood about 10, 15 or so, 20% of the vehicles aren't FFVs. Well, that's right, because those are products probably made for another market outside of Brazil and brought into the country that they don't control very well. But that's the product that is designed and made there may be a design brought in, let's say, from the United States, and they'll be tooled there, engine built there, and that product then would be designed to be certified there. Therein, it would be made for an in-country product using an E27 product. Those are not necessarily exported and very rarely exported here to the States. Make it and use it locally is a real good part of car companies. Sometimes powertrains are brought in from out of the country, and in Brazil, what happens when that happens most of the time, the product is brought in, it is recertified in Brazil by Brazil company employees just because the country likes it that way. At many times, the car is modified, maybe in this case, to put in a different controller to be compatible with the ethanol product. So what does that mean why can't we do it everywhere? Because it's designed for a specific market, and it wasn't designed, tested here. So what at least would have to happen is the whole testing and certification process would have to be run here. And if that's the case, it's a resource issue, not only with the car companies, but with EPA in California, because they have limited resources also. So it's at very least a long-term timing problem to get the product shifted. So that it's not that it can't be done, it's in the difficulty of getting the product approved and then certified for sale in the country. To some degree, the E30 testing program, which isn't that laugh out loud funny? EPA showed up and said, you can't do this. Yeah, no kidding. It's an illegal fuel, and there's a provision in the Clean Air Act that says you cannot modify a certified product. I mean, the product's been certified, and it's against federal law for you as a customer to modify that vehicle. So now you take it to a commercial setting and somebody walks in and says, I'll modify your vehicle for, tell me a number. And EPA knows where those people are, and EPA does, whenever they find extra time on their hands, they go out and chase down those guys, especially the ones that are good, because that way the word gets out faster. If it was just somebody, Joe Bob in his backdoor shop doing one or two vehicles for his buddies, they're not going to care. But a fellow like the one that was pointed out here today has obviously got a following, and when they walked into his shop, a lot of people heard about that. So the EPA likes bang for the buck. It's like the IRS. They're not going to necessarily go after any one of us, but they're going to go after somebody big with a big tax bill to make a headline, right? So this is the same thing with EPA chasing down the engine modifiers. So the illegal fuel, illegal operation, but also note they walked away. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but isn't that sort of curious, and doesn't that tell you something that maybe they do know, they have a sense of the pulse on this, and maybe it's something that they figure they shouldn't be hammering on too hard. The issue with can you use E30, E25, I don't care what the number is, but the number in vehicles and how far back are new vehicles, it's in testing. The car makers, the question is, how come you guys just don't warrant the vehicle for E25 and be done with it? And, well, because the vehicles of the past were not tested. Simple as that. It's not like they don't agree with everybody. It's simply that they do not have the test information in hand that says that the vehicle is compatible. Oh, but there's all this test information. We've got how many millions of miles and vehicles. A test program at an agency or a car company is very regimented, highly disciplined, and runs for millions of miles. And that testing is usually done on a comparison, so you run an E0 or E10 vehicle, and then you run a corresponding modified vehicle to accept a new fuel, and you run a whole bunch of them, then you try to do industry testing. So these things take millions of dollars and years, and very disciplined and result gathering as such. The relatively anecdotal approach of going out and putting vehicles into a community's, fuel into a community's vehicles is really good stuff, but it's not going to be robust enough to convince a car company to take the risk that that product is going to be able to enter the field on a nationwide basis, running this fuel, and run the risk of somebody or some percentage of vehicles turning on mills that they can't fix. Because that becomes a big-time warranty, and at worst, it becomes to a diligent class action attorney, which there are many around, they would love to find something like that, where the car company said, I don't know what the test result would be, but I approve the use of that fuel. Then have the thing break up, and then they go into court and say, Mr. Engineer, on what basis did you approve that? We had no basis. We just went along with the anecdotal information. Loser. So that's the reason that the car companies aren't going to do it. They got the product liability attorney sitting in the background saying you just can't. You don't have the test information unless you go back and do the testing, and that they're not going to do because they don't have the resources. All right, so why don't you do it now for your current product? One, the fuel that's being requested is an illegal fuel. The best way to fix that is to get EPA to declare illegal fuel by setting up a test fuel. Well, yeah, but why don't you just do it for this, and won't that bring EPA along? Not a bad idea. It's not a bad idea if this were the only request remotely similar to this that a car company might get. But even on the fuels thing, it's not going to be just one. Somebody's going to say E15, E20, E25, E30, E27 for Pete's sake. Then it's going to be, what about the thingamajig for traffic stoplight detection that you can put on your autonomous vehicle that right now is not legal either? Or what about name some other invention that might pop up that somebody thinks is a great idea? It's a resource, simply a resource issue. And even though it might appear to be a good idea, feel like a good idea, it takes something more to make that happen. So in this case, it's in some fashion, we need to get EPA to say the new fuel looks like this. And whether it's 94, 95 RON, or if it's 98 or 100, get them to say that. And once they say, here's a fuel that can be tested, you can use in fuel economy testing, and put it in place, and you get 5 stations in Kansas to put this stuff in a tank, it would be available for the car company to use. I am absolutely convinced that if the EPA said 98 RON E25 fuel, we approve that, and here's the spec, and somebody put that into a tank someplace, the car companies would use it, because they can take the fuel economy benefit. Now, they will argue, at least going in, that, gee, it's got to be generally available for all the customers that want it. Let's have that discussion later. Let's have that discussion later, because if they can get a fuel economy benefit by using that fuel, my bet is they would grab onto it. And if the fuel is priced right, and the market's going to pick it up, they'll take advantage of it and run with it. So, but that's a discussion I think we need to have in a broader audience, and just put the gauntlet down and say, now what? So how long will it take to put this in? You guys, folks, know that, first off, we've already said that the need for the fuel is there. And that's the United States, worldwide. It's a big need, and it's going to be around for our families, all the way through our grandkids at least, out many, many years. So people are going to make good living off of this, so it's going to be a long time thing in the market. So the need for the fuel is there. We know what it looks like. Name a number, high octane, and we know that corn is available to provide that product now, in the volume that can be used now. And again, I'm pointing, we've done this review looking at E25, and how fast can that be ramped up? Can it supply all the vehicles that would want it now? Well, if I go with our car company, will say I'll have a product certified to do something, that'll make it like a 22, 23 model year product. And our estimation is that clearly there's enough fuel potential to put in a market in volume to satisfy all the new vehicles that would be produced in that model year. Will it be evenly distributed? Yeah, the infrastructure is coming in too, folks. The underground tank stuff is supposed to be done. The only question is all that equipment certified to the requirements that are on the books for them to perform against now? Understand what I'm saying? The stuff that's in the ground is supposed to be capable of supporting an E100 product. Whether it does or not is subject to records keeping that has been a bit weak up until now. But the anecdotal information we have shows that people who are going out and trying to convert their stations to use an E25, E30 product are finding that most of this stuff is done, or if it needs a modification, it's an inexpensive switch. So the infrastructure, and also by 2022, above ground equipment needs to be chip card readable, or read chip cards, and the new pumps that are being produced with that capability are all being certified to an E40 product. So we estimate that just on normal turnover, there's going to be at least 40% of the pumps in the country will be E25, E40 capable, which is far more gasoline than is necessary to supply all the new cars. And so the infrastructure is there. So the only thing is missing now is, where is EPA? So back to, I think the fundamental bottom line here is, EPA, do your job. For all the reasons you guys mentioned, I won't double down on those. They're all the same ones. But the information's available to them, the product's available, the will would be there if they called out a fuel specification and recognized the value of ethanol as an oxygen enhancer in current day gasoline.
Well, great stuff, Reg. Lots of great progression of thought there. Just some things I was jotting down that we've either talked about in the past, or you just gave me an idea. But when was it? You talk about the fuel spec and how important that is for Unity. You recall that? I know you would. The World Fuels Charter idea. What happened? Try to remind me what happened to that. That was in that blur of the Clean Air Act and that movement, that whole time period where we were doing so much with fuels. For the audience, there was an effort to establish sort of a single formula that included oxygen. I believe it was a cap. At the time, MTB hadn't gone bad yet, so they preferred MTBE. But it was a recognition that oxygen brought you oxygen, it benefits, plus octane. And there was that whole effort by the auto industry and refiners and everybody else, say, look, let's have one formula. And that's a heck of an idea that, as you just alluded to, is hurting us right now. What happened to that, and is that something that could be brought back? Because you know refiners and automakers.
That's actually a good one, Doug. Something that I think would be worth asking now that people are interested in better formulations above what has been in the past. The Worldwide Fuel Charter is a living document. It is being used by the oil industry and the car manufacturers, the world's car manufacturers, to describe the proper matching of fuel formulation with vehicle technology level. And the vehicle technology level is being set at emission standards levels. So, European tier 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 now, and the U.S. standards tier 1, 2, 3. Then the fuels that are necessary to make those vehicles perform at those levels. The last one I recall calls for an E10 product. Again, the world's car makers agree that they will match the technology in a country, provided the country gets the fuel in there at the right level. So looking at the next fuel, could be time to get that discussion going.
A couple other things, just some throwing things back as as you've got me thinking, and I jotted down some things, and I hope we get some discussion from the audience. But another issue that we're working on, I'm not sure it came up earlier today, but is this whole concept that since E10 is the base cert fuel now, that we would argue that there is an argument, Boyd and Gray's made this argument very effectively, that the substantially similar law now has no cap. If 10% is in there, and you've approved 10% ethanol, we have certified on that the burden of proof is on EPA to show that higher blends actually degrade emissions or cause problems. Again, with your legal background in addition to your regulatory background, how does that argument hit you? Because, again, this is not something we thought about over drinks. I mean, Boyden has made a very compelling case for this, and we put it in front of EPA, and of course they haven't answered us.
Well, this is pretty simple. I agree. I've spent some time with that with Boyden and his staff. Really enjoy the thought process they went through and the proofs that they've come into. And it appears from that analysis, that's really clear. The EPA's got themselves backed into a pretty black corner that they need to approve higher blends if asked to do that. But the big challenge is, are they not going to? So therein, how does the community get EPA to not be able to weasel out of that kind of a corner?
Well, another thing you mentioned is it's so obvious to me. I use it in almost all my presentations. I don't know if it still exists, but you headed up U.S. Car, which was Ford, Chrysler, and GM, the three domestics. But I have some old charts from that where that as ethanol volume went up, and each time it went up, a little tweak of compression, and at the end of it, and I think Dave had it in his presentation, we were at 7% efficiency. That's a whopping increase, given that we think the new SAFE rule is going to be calling for 1.5, and I think even Obama was calling for 5. So the question is, why didn't, in your opinion, now that you're out of it, the autos, jump on that a little bit more? The whole octane argument just didn't, it just didn't quite resonate. It came and went fast. It seemed to me that there was there's always a technical recognition of that, but I can recall the RFA conference. That was the whole theme of the conference a couple of years ago. We see some of the auto folks out talking about it, and it's like, never mind, we've shifted gears. And that 7%, or anywhere in that range, 3, 4, 5, 7%, that's a whopping increase with minor changes to your cars, and I would argue it slows down the electric push. So I'm just curious why you think that petered out so fast.
I'll take the 5, 6, 7% thing as a given. Whether it's that number or not, let's not get into that. But that, as a fundamental for this discussion, that's a good number for this discussion. At that time, that's generally before the current president came in and pulled back the standards. The standards at that point were moving up like at 5% a year. And what got the car manufacturers to agree that the goal setting could be appropriately set at set at the rate that they were set for going out to 2025 was two things. One was a very important one, we call it the midterm review. And NHTSA had this is called a statutory requirement that they can only set standards out 5 years. So that was a nice break point. So NHTSA standards never did go into place, which are the fuel economy rules. And EPA standards, they could not make them final beyond 5 years, so they became recommendations. But the ramp rate was 5%. And that midterm review was going to assess, is industry capable of doing it? And the biggest question that was targeted, the biggest question was, are the customers accepting the technology in the marketplace at the rate that it needs to be introduced? I'll bet you never heard that one because EPA sort of forgot that one. But the second part of that was the technology had to be. The second part of it was nobody knew what the technology package was going to be out past about 2020, 2022 at that back in 2011 and 12 when these things were negotiated. And that's people say, well, yeah, you guys are smarter than that. Well, the car companies don't even know how they're going to price vehicles next year, let alone what technologies are going to go in 5 and 10 years from now. So the technology packages were coming along pretty good at that time, and that they were running out of ideas. So the technology not being known, a provision was put in to that list of regulations that allowed for the evolution of new ideas yet unknown. So the adoption of credits against not understood or off-cycle or some sort of packages that could come into play. I elaborate there because the fuel component in the automaker's mind was one of those, was one that they could sort of see out there. They could see if the fuel was there, we could use it. But understand that if the fuel was there, we could use it. The problem was they don't control fuel. They needed EPA help to do that, and then the industry's help of actually putting it in. But nonetheless, that's one idea. And let's say it's good for 5%. That was 1 year worth of step for an engine family or two that they could put in on a yearly basis. So it was far from the total technology package necessary. So what they did is they said that this is part of that. You need to allow us the opportunity to do more. And what happened with the new EPA is that those optional packages have been held back quite a bit. So they don't want to be arguing for one at the risk of, oh, you got that one, so we're not going to do any more. So they wanted to have a assurance that they were going to have access to the full future of unknown technology packages. So it's not that they wouldn't accept it or wouldn't push for it once the fuel was in place. It's just when the fuel was not in place, and if the fuel didn't show up, they'd have to go some other way. So they weren't going to waste political chits on something they had no certainty of seeing in the market.
Well, that's the dilemma, though, we're in. I mean, we make ethanol, and we put it out, we can use it in a number of different ways, including as E30 or E85 or E10 or anything else. But to go, all in on that and try to get E30 in lots of places, then the obvious question is, I hope the cars can handle it. So that's where this, I don't want to call it civil disobedience, but, this sort of go ahead and use it anyway, and it ties in with the testing. And Governor Noem, we had hoped to be in here today, but Larry Pierce alluded to this earlier, in Nebraska, the Dakotas, some other places, they're going past what Jim and Doug talked about earlier in South Dakota, and they're going to state fleet tests. So that's way above anecdotal. It's way above what they're doing. It's closer to data that can maybe lead to widespread acceptance. But I just would always argue that, people, well, show me the fuel. We know some people, I won't name it, who always challenges us at our ag auto ethanol meetings, but I can't show up at the fuel and say, sorry, nobody can use it. So there's got to be some cooperation. That's why the World Fuel Charter or something like that, where the autos were working closer with the ethanol community and sort of going down this road together rather than saying, you go first. No, you go first. And that's a real problem for us.
Well, maybe World Fuels Charter is a nice place to be able to start getting the right parties together, but that process is a bit diligent and long. But it's not we shouldn't do that. That's actually a good idea. Getting EPA to nod in the direction of if you bring a product in and test it on a new fuel, that will give you a certificate. That's the sort of bottom line. And what we've seen in the last couple of years is a reluctance on the car companies to be first. They seem to have a great fear at this point of not getting the right answer. And the discussion we saw today where EPA's reluctance or opposition to putting fuel in the market might be a real challenge, I think may be part of a company's reason for not taking the first step. But that discussion, folks, in my opinion, we've heard those. Doug, you and I have heard it. Companies bounce back at us, and then what we do is we get hit by it, and we sort of drop the conversation. I think we need to get some small group together and say, let's start this conversation again and say, on the basis, would you guys use it? What would it look like if you saw it, and who can actually take that request to EPA, and who's willing to make that shot? We have not wrestled that one to the ground.
One more thing, Reeve. I just want to close this thought process. So how do you get the autos a little more engaged? One of the things we talked about the other day, and I just want to talk about for a minute here is credits. I think the idea of credits to automakers is just left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouth. The E85 program was called a loophole by the environmental community because there was no set way to demonstrate that these FFEs are actually using the ethanol, and yet they were getting credits. I get that, but I think the ethanol industry was asleep at the switch to fix that. It was fixable. There were some things we talked about that could measure these, but by that time it was too late. But in even our other meetings since then, there's been a lot of discussion about, well, if the objective is to not use oil and you got credits at 85%, why wouldn't you get credits at 30? And if you could prorate those, and 30 is actually a better way to use it than the 85 from an efficiency standpoint. So you've told me many times that the auto guys would take the credits, but they're not going to fight for them. I'm not sure we couldn't turn that around to go and say, look, you guys are going to tweak your cars to get maximum performance, maximum emission reductions, maximum mileage, and meet the objectives of the original CAFE, which was to not use oil, and we can provide you with what you need there. So come in and at least smile and nod and say that credits would be helpful. But that's another thing, like Octane, I feel like they've just stepped off of. So I'm not going to give up on that one. I think it's an extremely defensible position to ask for credits. If you want me to not use oil, I cannot use oil, but I have to do something for it. And I think that's a road we could go down. But let me take a break. Reed has a question or comment.
Reg, you made a very compelling case why the auto companies want to have a standard fuel that they are going to build toward, and that suggests a process of collaboration toward agreement on a single spec fuel. My worry is that the least common denominator nature of that process will lead to a fuel standard that the oil companies are happy with because they can still use aromatics at their maximum value. That would be the worst possible outcome from our perspective in terms of public health and climate change. How do we avoid that outcome?
Well, that's a huge question, probably much bigger than we have time left to resolve. So I'll just give it a short shot. The refiners and GM largely came, and it was supported sort of subtly by Ford, came up with that solution, and that was a 95 RON E10 proposal, and that was linked to pulling off, eliminating the RFS. And that had so many negatives, like one, they can make it about at its current premium is what it is. So they wouldn't have to make any change, and then a lot of people who count it as necessary lose the RFS. So that wasn't the place to start. And the people who are making that argument, right now, it appears to me there's a lot of people afraid of the refiners, and for some reason don't want to go in separate from them, but they can't shoulder up to them because they don't agree with their position. So that leaves everybody outside the door. And I think some group folks have got to resolve, you've got to leave the refiners outside the door and go and talk to the policymakers. The car companies, deep down, don't really care about RFS, and they really don't care so much about the number, just as long as that number is bigger than it currently is and very narrowly scoped. They settled for 95 because of a couple of reasons that we won't get into right now. But if it came out as 98, they'd be happy. That's better. Higher is better. So I don't think and I think the argument pretty much is settled, not died. It's just gone away right now, to your point, Doug, because safe rules under debate, the huge fight between California and Trump administration, the separation of the companies, GM, Honda, Ford, for a safe rule and whether or not to involve California. The political fight right now is potentially so hot, or at least simmering strongly, that they really have to let that die, go away a little bit. Then we can get back into this fuels discussion. Now, the problem with that is that sort of says you got to wait for the safe rule, which then may or may not have a fuels component. Again, we got to talk about the strategy and such. The fuel component does not have to be in the safe rule. It would be really convenient, but it doesn't have to be. Is anybody talking about the fuel economy component, or fuel component in the current safe rule? I just don't know, because I've been outside of that discussion with you guys. So I think that demands a much deeper discussion, maybe another couple hours sometime, someplace. But great topic, though. That's in the next steps discussion, that we should bring that up, as far as we got to hold that discussion to actually frame it up, if nothing else.
Steve, you had a question? Would you share that mic, please?
Reg, you've mentioned this a couple times, and a few times I've even defended the auto industry because, you look at all the challenges the auto industry faces. I mean, in Tier 3 comments, the autos are very positive on higher octane. We have a lot of issues at the EPA, both for the auto industry and the ethanol industry. I mean, look at the R factor and the fact that if you can't fix an error at EPA, how do you fix policy? We have a letter by EPA in 1997 that we can't take more than a 3% advantage on octane between regular and premium. We've got, so the EPA hasn't updated their testing protocol yet for the OEMs. And we have moves. We have EPA coming out by March with the anti-backsliding study on ethanol, and we know that's not going to be positive. How do we get more traction at EPA if EPA clearly doesn't even listen to the auto industry? And to me, that's always amazing. Just the R factor alone is an example where you clearly pointed out an error in EPA's calculation. And I don't know if they were just mad because someone pointed out an error, that they just refused to even go to their own recommendations. So how do we fix EPA?
That's been a discussion of the day. How do we get EPA to do their job? Maybe that's better left to the next segment to look at the things to do. But that is a challenge. In one thing I would use to start, like the next segment, would be whatever we resolve to do to set our ladder to get to the next level. We got to start with a real firm, assured attention grabber that they then get stuck to and can't release, and then get them to grab the next one. But one thing we can't do is lay out the whole litany of things we got to have fixed, because they'll just flat out ignore us because they'll know nobody else is listening to that whole list. So we got to get them in the room so they can't get out. And then what I think will happen, I'm very convinced will happen if they get the right direction from the horse, is they will then have to fix those things to make their conclusion come out right. So we'll leave it at that.
Well, we talked about maybe just having a round-robin discussion here rather than people physically changing spots and.
But we want to have more TV.
Oh, that's true.
So
this is
we're
a
going
chance.
to leave Reg and Doug still in charge, so everything's fine here. We're going to bring Dave Hallberg back up, Ann Steckel, Carol Warner, and we'll just continue the discussion among ourselves for everybody's entertainment. Ernie Shea may join us. He's on a call, and
Doug? Doug and Jim and/or, and if we need to pull another chair up. Yeah.
okay, so Doug, you come on up, and we'll fill the chairs. That's enough for our chairs. Come on, Doug.
Well, you guys aren't